And I said, well, sure, don't know that. I had no idea. And he said, and so he told me this story. He said, I've been evangelist, and I got tired, worn down. And he said, one day I just said, Lord, if you'll give me a place where I can plant my feet, I will stay right there until you tell me to leave. And so he said, this little church came open. It didn't have an auditorium that big at that time, but he said we had 50 people when I came there. And he said, 10 years later, we had 50 people. He said, I worked, I did everything I knew to do. And he said, finally, 10 years down the road, with 50 people, we'd gained one new family, but we lost one. And he said, my youth pastor came and said, well, brother, pastor, he said he was weeping, and he said, I just can't raise my children in this church. I've just got to find something better than this for them. And he said, I said to him as I cried with him, I know how you feel. I'd do the same thing, but God, I told God I'd stay here. I told him I'd stay, and so I can't leave until he tells me. And he said, with that frame of mind, I came back to Dallas, Mesquite, Texas, where my mother lived, just to have a few days off. And he said, I asked her, is there anything going on here in Dallas spiritually? And she said, well, I've heard about a church out here in Rockwall. I don't know if she even remembered the name of it, but she said, they tell me that it's really something happening out there. So he said, I came out. And on Sunday morning, he said, when I got there, he said, just a lot of people standing outside in the hot sun. And he said, I thought, well, what's this? And he said, I found out that they're waiting for the service to get over. And he said, after a little while, the service was dismissed and people were trying to get in and people trying to get out. He said, I'd never seen anything like that before in my life. And he said, finally, I got in and I got a seat right at the back wall. He said, my head had hit the back wall when I nodded it back. And he said, somewhere during the service, pastor announced, we have prayer meeting here in the morning at 6 a.m. And if you'd like to come, well, Brother Will Hyde will be leading the prayer in the morning. So he said the next morning, I determined I'm going to that prayer meeting because I believe there must be some relationship between what's happening out here and that prayer meeting. And so he said, I came to that prayer meeting, and he said, you were leading prayer. And after it was over, he said, you came back, and because I was a newer person, he said, I guess. Anyway, I laid my hands on his shoulder, and I introduced myself to him, and I said, he said, you said to me, brother, do you have an early morning prayer in your church? And I said, well, no, we don't have. And he said, you told me I should do that. And he took that as a prophetic word. I didn't say, thus saith the Lord or anything, but he went back to his church. He told them what he had seen. And he said, I believe that God has spoken to me, that we're to have an early morning prayer meeting in this church. And he said, the people were so desperate that 30 out of the 50 came to that early morning prayer meeting at 6 a.m. in the morning. And he said, recently our administrator charted the history of the growth of this church. And he said it started right then when we started that early morning prayer meeting, desperate, seeking God desperately, not just a program. This was a response to a prophetic word. What he believed was a prophetic word to him and to the church. And he said, as we began to pray, the church began to grow. And now it's 1,500 people. We have 2 services. He said, I can't do more than 2 on a Sunday morning. But he said, it all happened when we began to really pray. And I believe there is a direct relationship between not just the amount of prayer, but the consistency of prayer and the confidence that God answers prayer. And if you'll begin to really pray and seek the face of God for revival, it will come to your church. It will happen because I believe it's the will of God. It's the will of God to bring revival right here in the United States of America. I know that He'll bring it anywhere where people will commit themselves not to a program of prayer. It doesn't work. I've seen churches try it. We've got a new program. We're going to really pray. Programmed prayer doesn't work. It has to be a complete understanding of the desperate need we have for God's divine intervention. And when we pray, we set up the appropriate conditions for supernatural intervention. God is willing to do it, but He will not do it until we pray.
Not only that, but I've noticed the testimony this morning of what you've been saying. Your father or your mother and father were Christians. Mine had the same experience. And then you talked about this preacher and different ones. And then you mentioned Cimbala.
Yeah.
Do you know? Did you know who his father-in-law was?
No, I don't know that.
His father-in-law was a baritone singer, or he was an opera singer at one time, Claire Hutchins, and he used to sing in all our independent conventions. And his wife was his daughter.
I see.
And she, of course, they've got the popular song, and she, with his background with fantastic singer, and he was converted, and he worked with our independent group. In fact, my pastor, when I was graduating from high school, had Claire Hutchins and his another preacher from Chicago come and hold a revival during the time when I was graduating from high school, and they were all there during the revival for my graduation. But you see, the point I want to bring out is how important it is for background. A lot of people don't realize the seed that's being sowed there in the hearts of the young people. He taught his daughter music, evidently because he was so musically inclined, and then they went there, and then I read in one of the books that he had got a lot of training from his son, from his father-in-law.
Yeah.
And you see, I'm not trying to, I just want to bring out the fact that we need prayer. I'm not minimizing that. I think this is great. But we also need to have prayer for our families and with our first and second and third generations. And this is where we're seeing the big revivals work out in so many cases.
Well, I think that's true. Of course, I've been involved in teaching on prayer for such a long period of time, and not just teaching, but actually praying and encouraging others to pray, not just as a discipline, even though I believe it is a discipline that Christians ought to develop, but there's a lot more to prayer than just discipline. I prayed a long time before I had any understanding of how prayer works. I didn't understand it. I prayed, but I couldn't understand why, if there is a God, and I certainly believe there is a God, I couldn't understand why, since He has all power and all authority, both in heaven and in earth, why would He want us to pray? After all, He's God. If He wants to do something, does He not have the power to get it done? Why should we have to pray about this? And for a long time, I could not understand this, and I couldn't ever get an answer from anyone. All the classics about prayer told us the position of our body or the form of our prayer that was to be used, and a lot of things like that, but nobody ever tried to explain why. So I wrote a book called Why Pray? Why would God want us to pray? Because He finally revealed to me why prayer was so important. And when I understood why it was so important, then I was able to do it more consistently and with greater understanding. And I believe faith is based on an understanding of why we're doing what we do. There's a reason. God doesn't just make things difficult. There's a reason for His telling us to pray. That He had a good reason for doing that, and it has to do with the free will of man. God does not force His blessings upon us.